He accidentally took hold of her royal behind. Now the queen declares only his hands can touch her. It was a bright, sunny morning, and the city was buzzing with excitement. People had gathered along the streets, lining up behind barriers, eager to catch a glimpse of the queen. Flags waved in the breeze. Children clutched their parents' hands, and photographers jostled for the best angles. Among the crowd of workers and volunteers preparing for the royal event was a young man named Daniel. Daniel was not someone used to crowds or ceremonies of this scale. In fact, he had spent most of his life doing ordinary jobs, quietly helping others without much recognition. But today, he had been chosen to assist at one of the biggest public events of the year, a royal appearance that would be broadcast live on television. The responsibility thrilled him, but it also made his stomach twist into knots. Daniel had arrived at the palace early that morning, dressed in the crisp uniform provided by the royal staff. He had been briefed carefully, told exactly where to stand, how to assist, and how to maintain the utmost respect for the queen and everyone attending. The instructions were clear, but Daniel knew that real-life situations rarely went exactly as planned. The palace grounds were enormous, filled with gardens, fountains, and long walkways. And hundreds of people were moving in every direction. Servants, guards, media personnel, and volunteers were all working like a well-oiled machine, but the machine was enormous and complicated. Daniel felt a little like a tiny cog, uncertain if he could keep up, yet determined not to make any mistakes. As the crowd outside grew louder, the palace gates opened, and the procession began. The queen was arriving, a figure of grace and dignity, her presence commanding attention even from a distance. Daniel's task was simple in theory: assist her in moving safely along certain areas, make sure she did not trip, and ensure her surroundings were secure. However, as the queen's car came to a stop and her entourage started moving, Daniel felt a sudden surge of adrenaline. His heart raced and his palms became sweaty. He tried to focus, repeating to himself all the instructions he had memorized. But the crowd's excitement made everything feel more chaotic than calm. Then it happened. As the queen approached the ceremonial platform, she had to step down from a slightly raised surface to continue walking. Daniel, positioned nearby, instinctively moved forward to assist. In that moment, a mix-up occurred. Perhaps it was the way the platform shifted, the crowd pushing a little from behind. Or Daniel's own nervousness, but his hands ended up in a position he had never intended. It was quick, almost unnoticeable to the untrained eye, but for the people watching, it appeared awkward. Daniel froze immediately, realizing he had made a mistake. His mind raced, and he felt the familiar tightness of panic in his chest. The queen, as always, maintained her composure. She moved gracefully, unfazed by the sudden pressure around her. But Daniel could see the subtle reaction of the people closest to her. Guards stiffened. Staff exchanged worried glances. And the photographers who had been eagerly snapping pictures captured the exact moment. Time seemed to slow down for Daniel, each second stretching endlessly. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, drowning out everything else. What had been meant as a small, careful gesture had suddenly become the center of attention. And Daniel felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. The crowd reacted instantly. Some gasped, some murmured among themselves, and a few whispered questions about what had just happened. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing multiple angles, and Daniel could feel their eyes on him. For a young man who had always tried to stay unnoticed, this was terrifying. He wanted nothing more than to disappear, to vanish behind the rows of guards and volunteers, but he could not move. His legs felt rooted to the ground, and his mind was frozen in a swirl of fear and regret. Every scenario he had imagined, every training drill, every warning had never prepared him for this sudden, public moment of embarrassment. The queen continued walking, her dignity intact. Yet Daniel could not shake the feeling that the incident would haunt him. He had been taught to handle royal events with precision, yet a single mistake had thrown everything into chaos. He wished he could rewind time, step back, and place his hands exactly where they were supposed to be. Instead, all he could do was stand there, hoping that somehow the moment would pass unnoticed. But he knew, deep down, that in the age of social media and instant photography, nothing ever truly passed unnoticed. After the platform, Daniel tried to regain his composure. He adjusted his uniform, straightened his posture, and reminded himself to breathe. He told himself that it had been an accident, that anyone could have made the same mistake under such pressure. Yet, the whispers continued to echo in his mind, and he felt a creeping sense of shame. What if this one moment ruined everything? What if he was blamed unfairly? What if his career ended before it had even begun? These questions gnawed at him relentlessly. Daniel's supervisors quickly approached. Their faces were serious but not angry. They guided him to a quieter area, away from the cameras and the crowd, and asked him to explain what had happened. He stammered through his words, trying to convey that it had been accidental, that he had only been trying to help. The officials listened intently, taking notes and nodding occasionally. Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps they would understand. Perhaps they would see that it was a genuine mistake. But uncertainty remained, hanging over him like a heavy cloud. Meanwhile, the event continued as planned. The Queen moved with elegance and poise, shaking hands, waving to the crowd, following the carefully scripted schedule. Daniel, now on the sidelines, watched every move, every smile, every gesture, trying to focus on the positive aspects of the day. Yet his mind kept returning to that single, fleeting moment of error. He could not help but replay it over and over in his imagination. Imagining what the world outside the palace gates was thinking, imagining the headlines that would appear the next day, imagining the looks of disappointment or disapproval as the day wore on. Daniel tried to stay professional, assisting where needed and following instructions meticulously. Every time the Queen approached, he felt a jolt of anxiety, his hands trembling slightly, his heart beating faster. But he did his best, careful not to repeat the mistake. Slowly, he began to notice small signs of reassurance, the Queen's calm demeanor, the subtle nods from her staff, the lack of any immediate reprimand. These small gestures gave him a tiny bit of hope, a whisper that perhaps the day would not end in disaster after all. By the time the ceremony concluded, the crowds began to disperse. Daniel was exhausted in every sense, physically, emotionally, and mentally. He had survived one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of his life, and though a single mistake had caused him immense anxiety, he had also proven to himself that he could handle the pressure. Walking back through the palace corridors, he reflected on everything that had happened. He realized that life often placed people in unexpected situations, testing their patience, courage, and composure. And sometimes, even when things went wrong, there was a chance for understanding and forgiveness. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, he could not stop thinking about the day's events. The images of the crowd, the flash of cameras, and the Queen's steady presence replayed endlessly in his mind. He felt a mixture of relief, fear, and anticipation. Relief that the day had ended without immediate catastrophe, fear of what the public and media might say, and anticipation of what the future would hold. He knew that the events of that day would mark a turning point in his life, shaping how he viewed responsibility, mistakes, and human kindness. And although he could not yet imagine it, this single, accidental moment would eventually lead to a story far greater than he could have ever expected. The morning after the royal event, Daniel woke up feeling a knot of anxiety in his chest. The sun streamed through his window, but he could not shake the heaviness that pressed down on him. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, messages from friends, and news alerts. He hesitated, unsure if he wanted to see the headlines, fearing that each one might mock him or exaggerate his mistake. Slowly, with trembling hands, he unlocked his phone and scrolled through the news. His fears were immediately confirmed. Every article seemed to describe the incident in dramatic terms. Royal mishap shocks crowd, one headline blared. Assistant's mistake in front of Queen, read another. The words seemed larger than life, making his small. Human error appeared catastrophic. Daniel's stomach churned as he read through the articles. Social media was even worse. Comments ranged from angry to mocking, some questioning how someone could be so careless in front of the Queen, while others shared memes and jokes, even though he knew deep down that it had been an accident. Seeing thousands of strangers discuss the moment so publicly felt like a heavy weight on his shoulders. Every notification made him jump. Every headline made him feel smaller. He tried to remind himself to stay calm, but it was impossible. His private world had been thrust into the spotlight, and he had no control over how people perceived him. Meanwhile, at the palace, the queen and her staff were handling the situation in their own careful, measured way. Inside the walls, there was no laughter or mockery, only concern and discussion. Officials debated how best to respond to the growing attention on Daniel's mistake. Some felt that the young man should face punishment, arguing that public figures required perfect service and that an incident like this could set a poor example. Others, more experienced in handling crises, pointed out that mistakes happen to humans, even in the most formal situations. They reminded their colleagues that the Queen's dignity and reputation had remained intact. After reviewing security footage and witness statements, a sense of calm began to emerge, even as the press outside continued its frenzy. Daniel, oblivious to the careful deliberation inside the palace, felt the world closing in around him. He had taken a day off work to recover from the mental strain, yet he could not stop imagining the worst-case scenarios. What if he was fired? What if the Queen never allowed him near her again? What if this one moment overshadowed every good deed he had ever done? He wandered through his small apartment, pacing back and forth, trying to shake off the panic. He called his best friend Sam, who tried to reassure him, saying, "It's okay, Daniel. Everyone makes mistakes. The Queen probably won't even be upset." But Daniel could not fully believe it. The words were comforting, yet they could not quiet the storm of anxiety swirling inside him. By mid-morning, Daniel's phone rang. It was the palace. His heart leapt into his throat. He swallowed hard, unsure whether to answer. The line connected, and a calm, professional voice spoke. "Daniel, the Queen would like to speak with you briefly at the palace. This is not a punishment. It is a request to understand the situation." Daniel felt his knees weaken. For a moment, he could not respond, his mind racing through every possible outcome. Finally, he managed to say, "Yes. Yes, of course. I will come immediately." He hung up and took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. Arriving at the palace, Daniel felt as if every eye in the world was on him. The grand halls, usually filled with tourists and awestruck visitors, seemed silent, almost oppressive. He was led to a small private room where the Queen often held brief meetings. There she waited, seated with her usual poise and serenity. Her expression was calm but curious, not angry. Daniel bowed deeply, feeling the weight of formality and respect. And began to explain exactly what had happened the previous day. He described the chaos of the crowd, his own nervousness, and the moment when he had unintentionally made contact. His words were rushed, his voice slightly trembling, yet sincere. The Queen listened attentively, nodding occasionally. She did not interrupt, nor did she display even the slightest hint of anger. Daniel continued, sharing how mortified he felt, how he feared the consequences, and how deeply he regretted the mistake. He admitted that he had feared public humiliation and wondered if his life's path had been altered forever. After he finished, the Queen leaned back slightly and considered his words carefully. She asked a few calm questions, not to challenge him, but to understand. Why had he moved as he did? Was he following instructions? How had he felt in that brief moment? Daniel answered honestly, revealing his genuine intention to help and his fear at the thought of letting the Queen down. After a long pause, the Queen smiled gently. It was not a broad or exaggerated smile, but one that conveyed understanding and compassion. "Daniel," she said softly, "I can see that this was an accident. Your intention was to assist me, and your concern for my safety was clear. That is what matters. People often judge only by appearances, but I know the truth." Daniel's eyes widened. Relief and disbelief washed over him. The Queen, the same woman who had seemed untouchable and distant, was showing him understanding and kindness. It was more than he could have hoped for as the day progressed, and you'll learn that the palace would not be issuing any formal punishment. The staff reassured him privately that accidents happen, and the Queen had chosen to trust his intentions rather than focus on a fleeting error. Nevertheless, Daniel remained cautious. He knew the outside world might not be so forgiving. When he stepped outside, the crowds had mostly dispersed. but the feeling of scrutiny lingered. Journalists continued to follow minor stories, and social media buzzed with speculation. Daniel realized that while the palace might have forgiven him, the world at large could take longer to understand. Over the following days, Daniel experienced a mixture of emotions. He felt relief and gratitude toward the Queen and the staff who had supported him. But he also continued to feel nervous, as if the public's judgment could strike at any moment. He tried to go about his daily life, feeding, reading, even sleeping, but the memory of the incident and the potential fallout stayed with him. He thought about how quickly mistakes could spread, how public perception often overshadowed reality, and how people sometimes forgot the human side of events. This awareness made him more reflective and cautious, shaping the way he approached his work and life at the same time. The Queen's staff began to notice something unusual. Daniel, instead of retreating in shame, was determined to prove his reliability. He returned to his duties with care, patience, and attention to every detail. His nervousness was still visible, but it was paired with a sense of determination. He seemed to understand that actions mattered more than rumors, that trust could be rebuilt through consistent effort. For the first time, some staff members began to see the young man not as a liability, but as someone willing to learn and grow from a difficult experience. As the week went on, the media continued to cover the story, though the tone began to shift. Initially, the headlines had been harsh, emphasizing the mishap. Gradually, however, more nuanced stories appeared, highlighting the Queen's understanding and the humanity behind the incident. Some commentators praised the Queen for her wisdom, noting that her decision to consider intent rather than optics set a positive example. Others shared stories of Daniel's dedication and sincerity, painting him as a young man who had faced a difficult moment with humility. Daniel read some of these articles with a mixture of relief and surprise. Realizing that public opinion could evolve when the truth and context were presented by the end of the week, Daniel felt a cautious optimism. He had survived the storm of public scrutiny and learned valuable lessons about responsibility, integrity, and human kindness. He also began to understand the complexity of the world in which the Queen lived, a world where appearances mattered, yet where intention and character could still shine through. The incident, while embarrassing, had taught him resilience and the importance of trust, not just in others, but also in himself. Daniel's life had changed in subtle but profound ways. He no longer saw mistakes as the end of the world, but as opportunities to learn and grow. He became more observant, careful, and thoughtful in his work. And though he remained aware of the potential for public scrutiny, he also carried a quiet confidence that came from knowing that even in moments of error, understanding and forgiveness were possible. Little did he know, this journey of growth and trust was only just beginning. The story of that single, accidental moment would soon take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge his perceptions, shape his destiny, and ultimately lead to an outcome far beyond anything he had imagined. Days passed since the incident, but Daniel could not fully escape the feeling of unease. Though the palace had shown understanding, and some media coverage had begun to shift in a positive direction, the memory of that accidental moment remained vivid in his mind. He replayed it endlessly, analyzing every movement, every glance, every subtle reaction from the Queen, her staff, and the crowd. Even at home, he found it hard to concentrate on ordinary tasks. The incident had made him more self-aware than ever before, forcing him to consider how small actions could carry enormous consequences, especially in the public eye. Meanwhile, inside the palace, the Queen was quietly observing the situation. Unlike the public, she did not rely on headlines, gossip, or social media to understand events. She had access to multiple perspectives, official reports, eyewitness accounts, and detailed security footage. The moment of accidental contact had been brief, almost imperceptible, yet it had sparked widespread attention. Some staff members urged her to issue a formal statement, clarifying that the young man had acted with care. Others suggested distancing from him to avoid further scrutiny. But the Queen, who had spent decades understanding human nature and leadership, sensed there was more to the story. She was not interested in appearances alone. She wanted to understand intent, thought, and character. She asked her senior aides to arrange a complete review of the day. Footage from multiple angles, statements from volunteers, guards, and even guests were collected and carefully analyzed. Every detail was scrutinized, from the speed of the crowd's movement to Daniel's posture and gestures. The Queen studied the clips herself, observing Daniel's reactions with keen attention. She noticed that his hands had moved quickly, almost instinctively, to prevent her from losing balance. There was no hesitation, no sign of recklessness, only a sincere effort to assist. His eyes showed concern, his movements reflected responsibility, and his body language revealed tension rather than intent. The more the Queen observed, the more she felt a sense of clarity. While the public might see only a single image, she could understand the complete context. She reflected on how easy it was for society to judge without knowing the full story, to form opinions based on snapshots rather than the entire sequence of events. She realized that Daniel, a young man barely familiar with the grandeur of royal protocol, had faced extraordinary pressure, and yet he had acted with instinctive care, prioritizing her safety above his own comfort and fear. This perspective gave her pause and a renewed sense of appreciation for the human side of the situation. During this reflection, the Queen began to recall her own experiences with mistakes and public judgment. She remembered moments early in her reign when she had been misinterpreted or criticized unfairly. At first, she had felt anger and frustration, believing that perfection was expected of those in positions of responsibility. Over time, however, she had learned the value of empathy, patience, and understanding. She knew that errors, especially accidental ones, were part of life, and that compassion often led to stronger relationships than punishment ever could. Daniel's situation reminded her of those lessons, and she considered how leadership required seeing beyond appearances to the deeper truth. The Queen also reflected on the concept of trust. In her role, trust was both fragile and essential. She relied on countless individuals each day to ensure her safety, comfort, and dignity. One accidental mistake could be taken as a sign of incompetence or carelessness, but she understood that true trust was built over time. Through consistent intentions and actions, Daniel's behavior, observed under extreme scrutiny, demonstrated a willingness to serve faithfully despite fear and inexperience. She recognized that trust was not about perfection. It was about sincerity and effort. This insight shaped her growing conviction that the young man deserved not blame, but an opportunity to continue earning her confidence. After careful consideration, the Queen decided to speak privately with her closest advisors. She emphasized that they should not act based on public opinion or fear of scandal. Instead, they were to focus on the truth, the intent behind actions, and the character of the individual involved. She expressed her desire to reward accountability and sincerity rather than punish a minor error blown out of proportion. Her aides listened carefully, noting that her perspective was unusual yet powerful. It was clear that the Queen intended to challenge the conventional approach, which often prioritized appearances over substance in private. She also contemplated how to communicate her decision in the future. She realized that Daniel's story could become a lesson for others, showing that mistakes were human, that sincerity mattered, and that leadership involved understanding rather than condemnation. She envisioned a future scenario in which this incident, initially perceived as negative, would instead highlight the importance of empathy, forgiveness, and the careful assessment of human behavior. Such reflection required courage, as it meant going against the expectations of the public, the media, and even some palace officials. Yet she felt confident in her judgment. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to navigate his own challenges. Though the Queen had shown understanding, he remained wary of public reaction. He focused on performing his duties with meticulous care, observing every instruction, anticipating every potential hazard, and ensuring that his movements were precise. His nervous energy, once overwhelming, was now channeled into preparation and vigilance. He became more observant, noticing details he had previously overlooked. The Queen's walking patterns, the subtle cues from guards, and the timing of ceremonial movements. This heightened awareness allowed him to act with both caution and efficiency, demonstrating not only responsibility, but also a growing competence. Daniel also sought guidance from mentors outside the palace. Experienced professionals offered advice on managing public perception, maintaining composure under scrutiny, and understanding the pressures of working in highly visible roles. They emphasized that mistakes did not define a person. How one responded to them did. Daniel absorbed these lessons eagerly, applying them to his daily routine. With each passing day, his confidence grew, tempered by humility and awareness. He began to feel a sense of resilience he had never known before, recognizing that his accidental mistake had sparked a personal journey of growth. Back in the palace, the queen continued her quiet observation. She noted how Daniel's demeanor had changed subtly over time. Though still respectful and careful, he exuded a quiet confidence that suggested he was learning from the incident rather than being consumed by it. She found this encouraging. It reinforced her belief that human potential often revealed itself most clearly in moments of challenge and scrutiny. By maintaining a balanced perspective, she could not only guide Daniel's growth, but also send a broader message about the value of empathy and measured judgment. Finally, after several days of reflection and consultation, the queen made a decision. She concluded that Daniel's actions had been guided by genuine care, that his mistake had been unintentional, and that his overall character warranted continued trust. She recognized that he had faced an extraordinary moment of pressure and had responded with sincerity and courage. It was clear to her that the young man was capable of growth, responsibility, and loyalty. In her eyes, he was more than the brief moment of error captured on camera. He was a person deserving of understanding, opportunity, and guidance. This private reflection set the stage for what would come next. The queen's perspective was not widely known yet, but it would soon influence how she acted publicly and how Daniel's story unfolded. Her insight, patience, and empathy were laying the foundation for an unexpected turn one that would transform the incident. From a source of anxiety into a story of trust, human understanding, and recognition. Daniel, unaware of the full scope of the queen's contemplation, continued to perform his duties faithfully, slowly learning the balance between fear, responsibility, and confidence. The story of Daniel and the queen was quietly evolving, shaped by observation, reflection, and compassion. What had begun as a moment of accidental contact was becoming an opportunity to explore the deeper qualities of human behavior: honesty, attention, resilience, and trust. The queen's understanding perspective contrasted sharply with the outside world's tendency to judge hastily, illustrating a timeless lesson about patience, insight, and leadership. And though Daniel could not yet see the full picture, the unfolding events were already beginning to transform him, preparing him for the next chapter of his life, one in which his courage, sincerity, and humility would play a central role. The day the queen made her announcement arrived with a sense of tension and anticipation that filled the palace halls. Daniel had been told to be present at a specific area during the morning ceremony. Though he was not yet aware of the full extent of what was about to happen, he approached the palace with a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. Over the past week, he had learned to manage his anxiety, but this moment felt different. Something in the air told him that the events of the previous days were about to take a new, unexpected turn. He adjusted his uniform, straightened his posture, and reminded himself to stay calm, all the while aware of the eyes that would soon be on him. Both inside and outside the palace, the queen's staff were busy with preparations. Every detail of the announcement had been planned carefully. They understood that this declaration would be unusual, even unprecedented. Most of the advisors had initially worried about public perception, concerned that involving Daniel directly in a ceremonial role could attract scrutiny or criticism. But the queen was firm. She had reflected deeply on the incident, weighing intent, character, and the human response to mistakes. She was determined to act according to her judgment, demonstrating not only trust in Daniel, but also an example of empathy and understanding for the public to witness. As the ceremony began, Daniel was stationed near the entrance, his nerves vibrating like a tight wire. People had started to gather, and the crowd's excitement reminded him of the day of the original incident. Photographers adjusted their lenses, reporters whispered into microphones, and television crews prepared for the live broadcast. Daniel could feel the collective anticipation pressing on him, and for a moment, he wondered if he was truly ready for whatever the Queen had planned. He took a deep breath, recalling the lessons of the past week, the importance of focus, the value of sincerity, and the need to remain calm under pressure. Then the Queen appeared. She moved with her usual grace, the epitome of composure, acknowledging the crowd with her gentle wave and poised smile. Every eye in the audience seemed to follow her, capturing the elegance of her movements and the calm authority she carried. As she approached the ceremonial platform, Daniel instinctively stepped forward, ready to assist, but also bracing himself for something unexpected. The atmosphere felt charged with anticipation. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a sense that this was not just another ceremonial appearance, but a moment that might redefine how everyone present perceived both Daniel and the Queen. The Queen began to speak. Her voice was steady, clear, and commanding, yet carried a warmth that immediately drew attention. She addressed the gathered audience, acknowledging the excitement of the day, the dedication of the volunteers, and the commitment of those who worked tirelessly to ensure safety and order. Then, with a calm, deliberate tone, she mentioned the incident that had occurred days earlier. She described it not with accusation, nor with embarrassment, but as a minor accident that had been misinterpreted by some. She emphasized the context, explaining that what mattered most was the intention behind actions. That true understanding required looking beyond appearances. Daniel listened, astonished. He had expected some acknowledgement, perhaps a brief comment, but not this level of thoughtful explanation. He could hardly believe the words he was hearing. The Queen continued, speaking directly to him, though addressing the audience as well. She praised his dedication, his concern for her safety, and his willingness to act responsibly under pressure. She highlighted his growth over the past week, noting how he had transformed his initial fear into careful observation and steadfast action. Daniel felt a mix of relief, pride, and disbelief. The person he had long regarded as distant and unapproachable was now publicly recognizing his efforts in a way that was both generous and meaningful. Then came the declaration. The Queen announced that Daniel would continue to assist her personally during public engagements, emphasizing that she trusted only him to act in moments requiring close support. She explained that this decision was not merely about a single mistake, but about the consistent demonstration of integrity, care, and responsibility. The crowd listened in stunned silence, and a wave of whispers passed through the audience. Many struggled to comprehend the unconventional nature of the announcement. A young man who had made a public error was now being recognized and entrusted with a highly visible and important role. Daniel felt a surge of emotion he had never experienced before, a combination of relief, gratitude, and newfound confidence. As the Queen continued, she addressed the broader implications of her decision. She spoke about the value of empathy, of understanding human intentions, of recognizing effort rather than solely judging outcomes. She reminded everyone that mistakes were part of life, but how one responded to them mattered far more than the error itself. Her words resonated deeply, not just with Daniel, but with all those present. Volunteers, staff members, and even the audience members seemed to feel the impact of her message. It was a subtle but powerful lesson, demonstrating that leadership involved patience, insight, and a willingness to see beyond immediate appearances. Daniel could hardly focus on the crowd or the cameras. His attention was entirely on the Queen, who had just transformed what had been a moment of anxiety and shame into a moment of recognition and trust. He felt a profound sense of responsibility. This was not merely about performing a task correctly. It was about upholding the trust that the Queen had placed in him, about demonstrating the sincerity and care that had led to this unprecedented decision. He understood that he had been given an opportunity to prove himself, and that this moment would shape not only his own life, but also how others might perceive him in the future. After the announcement, Daniel assisted the Queen as usual, but now with a newfound confidence. He moved carefully, yet without fear. Each step he took was deliberate, each gesture attentive and precise. The Queen noticed this subtle change, and a small approving smile crossed her face. She understood that trust was not simply given. It was reinforced through action. Daniel's demeanor reflected both his gratitude and his commitment to uphold the responsibility she had entrusted to him. Outside the palace, news crews scrambled to cover the unexpected announcement. Headlines quickly shifted from criticism to admiration. Stories emphasized the Queen's understanding, Daniel's sincerity, and the unusual nature of the decision. Social media, which had been harsh and judgmental days before, began to highlight messages of respect and inspiration. People discussed not only the incident itself, but the broader lesson it represented, that mistakes did not define character, that sincerity mattered, and that trust could be earned through genuine effort. Daniel read some of these reports later and was amazed at the turnaround. What had once seemed like public condemnation had now become a story of recognition, empathy, and growth. The palace staff, too, responded positively. They saw the power of the Queen's choice, not merely in terms of protocol, but in the example it set for others. Her decision demonstrated that leadership could be compassionate without being weak, that acknowledgement of intent could coexist with the maintenance of standards, and that opportunities could arise from moments of challenge rather than fear alone. Daniel's example became a quiet inspiration within the palace, illustrating that integrity, humility, and dedication were values worth cultivating in every role, no matter how small or large. By the end of the day, Daniel was exhausted, but in a profoundly different way than before. Previously, fatigue had come from anxiety, from worry, and from the tension of public scrutiny. Now, it was a fatigue born of relief, accomplishment, and responsibility. He felt the weight of the trust placed upon him, but it was not a burden in the same way. Instead, it was a guiding force, motivating him to act carefully, responsibly, and with intention. He understood that the path ahead would require continued diligence. But he also recognized the rare privilege of having earned such confidence from a figure as respected as the Queen. That evening, as Daniel reflected on the events of the day, he realized how much he had changed. The accidental incident, which had once filled him with fear and shame, had become a catalyst for growth, trust, and recognition. He had learned lessons about patience, human nature, responsibility, and the power of sincerity. And most importantly, he'd experienced firsthand the impact of compassion and understanding from someone in a position of authority. The Queen's public declaration had transformed not only his career, but also his sense of self, instilling in him a confidence and awareness he had never known before. The story of Daniel and the Queen was no longer just about a minor mistake. It had become a story of human understanding, the importance of intent, and the transformative power of empathy. It showed that even in moments of public scrutiny and pressure, there was room for growth, redemption, and recognition. Daniel, now fully aware of the responsibility he carried, felt ready to embrace the next steps in his journey. The Queen's declaration had not only affirmed his past actions but also set the stage for a future defined by trust, dedication, and meaningful service. After the Queen's unexpected announcement, Daniel's life began to change in ways he could never have imagined. The initial fear and anxiety that had consumed him for days slowly gave way to a sense of purpose. No longer was he simply a young man trying to do his job without making mistakes. He had become someone entrusted with responsibility, someone who had earned the confidence of one of the most respected figures in the country. The weight of that trust was immense, but instead of feeling crushed by it, Daniel felt inspired. He understood that his actions now mattered in a way they never had before. He was determined to rise to the challenge. The weeks that followed were a mixture of excitement, learning, and careful adjustment. Every public event he attended alongside the Queen became an opportunity to prove himself. Daniel moved with attention and grace, carefully following the protocols he had once found intimidating. He anticipated the Queen's movements, stayed alert to every detail of the environment, and ensured that she remained comfortable and secure. Yet, more importantly, he did so with confidence rather than fear. The confidence he had gained was not just from practice, but from the knowledge that the Queen had seen his intentions clearly, understood his sincerity, and chosen to trust him. The public continued to take notice as well. Stories of the Queen's unusual decisions spread far and wide, and Daniel became something of a symbol for the idea that mistakes did not define a person. Interviews, news articles, and even social media posts highlighted the story, emphasizing the lessons of trust, responsibility, and understanding. People admired not only the Queen's wisdom, but also Daniel's humility and dedication. Young people, especially, saw his story as inspiration. It showed that even a moment of fear or embarrassment could become a turning point if met with honesty, care, and perseverance. Daniel's life, once ordinary and quiet, had become a story of growth that others could look up to. Despite the external attention, Daniel remained humble. He understood that the trust he had earned was not permanent and could be lost through carelessness or overconfidence. He approached each day with mindfulness, determined to act responsibly in every situation, no matter how small. He reflected often on the events that had led to this point, the initial accidental moment, the fear that had followed, and the Queen's patient understanding. Each reflection reminded him of the importance of sincerity and integrity, and he carried these lessons into every aspect of his life. His colleagues at the palace noticed the transformation as well. Volunteers, staff, and even senior officials began to treat him differently, recognizing not only his competence, but also his resilience and humility. Daniel's growth had become a quiet inspiration for those around him. He often offered guidance to new volunteers, sharing his experiences without embellishment or boastfulness. He emphasized the value of attention to detail, patience, and learning from mistakes. Through his actions and words, Daniel became an example of how personal responsibility and sincerity could earn respect, trust, and even admiration. In time, Daniel began to see the broader impact of the Queen's decision. It was not just about him. It was about the message it sent to the public and the palace staff alike. Leadership, he realized, was not only about rules, protocols, or appearances. True leadership, as demonstrated by the Queen, involved empathy, understanding, and the courage to recognize human effort. By standing by him, she had shown that mistakes, when met with honesty and responsibility, could become opportunities for growth rather than moments of shame. This understanding changed the way Daniel viewed authority, responsibility, and the people around him. The media continued to follow the story, though the tone had shifted entirely. Initial ridicule had transformed into admiration, and the narrative now celebrated Daniel's journey of redemption and the Queen's wisdom. Editorials discussed the value of evaluating intent rather than judging by appearances. Social media posts praised both Daniel and the Queen, sharing messages about resilience, accountability, and personal growth. Daniel, once overwhelmed by public opinion, now found encouragement in seeing how his story inspired others. He realized that moments of challenge, when handled with sincerity and care, could ripple outward in unexpected and meaningful ways. Over time, Daniel began to reflect more deeply on himself. He realized that the incident had not just been a public challenge, but a personal turning point. The fear, embarrassment, anxiety he had initially felt had forced him to confront his limitations and develop new strengths. He had learned patience, mindfulness, and composure. He had discovered a capacity for responsibility and empathy he had never known. The Queen's understanding had given him the space to grow, and he now felt capable of handling challenges with clarity and integrity. His relationship with the Queen also evolved. What had begun as a formal assistant role became a partnership based on trust and mutual respect. Daniel felt a deep sense of responsibility to maintain the confidence she had placed in him, and she, in turn, trusted him with moments requiring care and discretion. This bond, built on understanding rather than fear, became a quiet but powerful aspect of both their lives. It demonstrated the extraordinary potential of human connection when approached with sincerity, respect, and empathy. Daniel's personal life was influenced as well. Friends and family, once concerned about the public scrutiny he faced, began to see his growth and maturity. They noticed his calm confidence, his thoughtful approach to challenges, and his ability to handle responsibility without arrogance. Daniel shared his experiences with them, emphasizing the lessons he had learned, that mistakes were opportunities, that trust was earned through sincere effort, and that understanding others' intentions was as important as judging actions. These lessons shaped his interactions beyond the palace, improving his relationships and making him a more thoughtful, reliable person. Years passed, and Daniel continued to serve with diligence and care. The story of that single, accidental moment remained a defining chapter in his life, but it no longer caused anxiety or shame. Instead, it became a source of pride and reflection. He often thought about how a brief incident, initially perceived as a mistake, had led to recognition, personal growth, and a unique bond with one of the most respected figures in the country. He understood that life could turn on small, unexpected moments, and that how one responded to those moments often determined the course of one's journey. The Queen's decision became part of her legacy, celebrated not just for the trust she showed Daniel, but for the broader message it conveyed about leadership, compassion, and human understanding. Her actions illustrated that true authority was not about fear or perfection, but about recognizing the potential for growth, trusting in sincerity, and valuing human effort. Daniel's story, intertwined with hers, became a testament to the power of empathy, the importance of intention, and the transformative nature of trust, eventually. Daniel began to mentor new assistants and volunteers, sharing his experiences and lessons. He emphasized that mistakes were natural, but that integrity, care, and responsibility could turn even a moment of embarrassment into a story of growth. He encouraged others to remain calm under pressure, to learn from their errors, and to understand that human judgment was often imperfect. His guidance helped many young people navigate the challenges of working in high-pressure, public-facing roles, and his story continued to inspire long after the original incident had faded from the headlines. Looking back, Daniel realized how far he had come. From the day of the accidental contact, through the anxiety, public scrutiny, and private reflection, he had transformed into a confident, responsible, and thoughtful individual. He had learned that life's challenges were not obstacles to fear, but opportunities to grow. He had discovered the power of empathy, the importance of trust, and the value of sincerity. And he had come to understand that even a brief moment, when met with integrity and humility, could become the foundation for a lifetime of growth and meaningful relationships. In the end, the story of Daniel and the Queen became more than just a tale of an accidental mistake. It became a story about human understanding, resilience, and the potential for redemption. It was about how trust, once earned, could open doors to unexpected opportunities. It was about the courage to act with sincerity, even under pressure, and the power of leadership rooted in empathy rather than fear. And it was about how a young man, once consumed by anxiety and self-doubt, found his place in the world through the guidance, understanding, and trust of a remarkable queen as Daniel walked through the palace gardens one afternoon. Reflecting on his journey, he smiled quietly to himself. He had learned that life could change in a single moment, and that the way he responded could shape not only his own future, but also the lives of those around him. He felt grateful for the lessons, the trust, and the extraordinary opportunity he had been given. And as he continued to serve with care and dedication, he carried with him the knowledge that even in moments of fear or error, human understanding and empathy could transform everything, turning a mistake into a story of growth, trust, and lasting legacy.